All right, I got Saturn in the fifth house today, and this is gonna be the last of the fifth house series. Um, so we got Saturn in the fifth house. Saturn is the planet of discipline, structure, restrictions, limitations. You gotta cut back on shit. Like you gotta look at things from a real perspective. Saturn's like the one that brings you back into reality. You see things for what they are, and then the real moves that you have to make to build your life. And that certain things call for certain actions that you have to take. It means that you have to cut people off. It means you have to stay away from certain things, certain vices, shit like that. And Saturn has to deal with all that stuff, right? And then the fifth house, house of creativity, house of joy, entertainment, and recognition. So this placement isn't a so much a fun placement, but see you still see the benefits of this um, disciplined and very restrictive, or you know setting limitations for yourself, like necessary limitations for yourself. It ain't we go out fun all the time, and everything's gonna be peachy keen and cool, and this and that. You have to still put in work. You still have to put in effort. You still have to cut people off out of your life sometimes to make other things happen, to build a life that you want to have. And then when you have kids, right, because you're going to probably have kids if you have displacement, and um you're going to definitely be a parent that's laying the law on your kids, being like, when you're in my house, you can't hang out with these people. You won't go to parties. You'll come home at this specific time, and if you don't, the consequences of this: a belt to your ass. Something like that. You know, it comes with displacement. All that kind of shit comes with displacement. But I'm telling you through all the signs, because everybody has a different Saturn sign, right? So with Aries, Saturn, you are a person who is definitely laying that on them. People. So you probably like to have fun. At the same time, when you have a goal in mind to build your home, build your life, build your career up, you're gonna lock the fuck in, and you're gonna be like, no, I have this to do. I'm doing this. I'm not fucking around. I'm not playing games. And you tell people that, you might sound, very aggressive. You might sound very, mean. It don't fucking matter. You're letting them know. I cannot, fuck around and play games with you guys. I am going to do what I have to do at work. Really lock in on that. You know. And then if you have kids too, they might think you're um unreasonable or selfish when you're laying down rules, because you're a person who, it's all right for you to have fun, right? But then, for your kids, you're like, no, you can't do that. You're not an adult yet. You can't do that. That's for the, real adults to do. You can't do that. And if you do that, you're gonna, face the consequences. You'll get your ass whooped. If you try to be like your daddy, you know, you try to be like, your mama, for, females who have kids and shit like that, right? And you're still, disciplining your children. You know, you might have, conflict with your children, but you're also a bit, creative too. You're not always, like that. You'll get creative with the way you punish your kids too. Um, that being said, the next sign is Taurus Saturn in the fifth house. This person is definitely structured. You got to do these things in my house. Um, when I'm fucking around with people, if it's just me and I'm not a parent, right? I need to do these kind of things. I need to make these kind of moves. I don't care what somebody else said because I'm still sensible. I'm still gonna build the life that I need to make for myself. I won't be partying. I won't be seeking this from these people or whatever because I need to have this kind of house, this kind of car. I'm more focused on what I have to do to get that. That process of getting these things in, right? Making sure my finances are in order. Specifically that, these people care about being financially, savvy. And, if I have to wait to, buy something until I have, my money right, then that's what it has to be. You know, I that's just how it is, and these people, might be, upset about it or whatever, but they will never, um, bitch about that. They might, to themselves or whatever, but they understand it's just a part of life, and that's reality. You ain't gonna get everything right away. Um, they have um next sign, next Saturn sign is Gemini Saturn in the fifth house. Gemini Saturn in the fifth house. You gotta talk to people. You gotta communicate with people. But it's not just talking for the sake of talking. You're talking to, get your life right. You're talking to make moves. You wanna, be the person who knows exactly what they want, and then you're asking for it. You're asking what you gotta learn about, what you gotta study more in order to, keep, your life in order. Um, you might even say fuck your friends who are, doing too much partying and shit. And you're still looking for other people though. You're still learning. Like you might take on mentorships and shit like a lot though. Not just a little bit, a lot. And you are doing that, you're always looking for somebody to learn from. You know, you're studying books. You're keeping, your life in order. You're only consuming, certain information, but you're still learning like all kind of information, right? You're not just reading one kind of book. You're reading, books about this, books about that. You want to be somebody who's very, knowledgeable on things, right? And then can deliver that to people and talk to people about it. And you might even be somebody who teaches somebody about something you read, or somebody that taught you something. You might talk to them about this is the person I learned this from. And really teaching people how to like get their lives right. Stay on track on what they got to do for themselves. Have your house, have your finances in order, these specific, places to invest money in, these specific, banks to, do banking with, these specific houses to, buy these specific houses to stay the fuck away from these kind of neighborhoods, and you have information on all of that. You make sure you know all this stuff. You make sure you talk to the right people about shit. You are not gonna go to a like you're definitely a person, right? You're not gonna listen to a talks. You'll actually stay the fuck away from the baker. I don't need to know about that because I don't need to know that. It's not even, you're restricting yourself from learning. You're only focused on becoming smarter, more knowledgeable on how to keep what you have in life so you don't lose it. Next sign is Cancer Saturn in the fifth house, right? Cancer Saturn in the fifth house, you're a person that, needs that connection. You want that, family. You want that stable lifestyle for your family. You're gonna like work hard. You're gonna, do what you can for the people you, really care for. You know, your family members. That could be your wife, your, husband. Whatever that shit is. You're gonna make sure your kids are taken care of. You like to really spend time with them. But in doing that, also you're more emotional. So Cancer and Saturn and Cancer, right? That is a detrimental placement. Not the worst placement to have, but it's also not the best placement to have either. So you might be, at odds with your lover. You're a little more creative, actually. But with this creativity comes, not setting, boundaries for yourself. You want to, be with your family. You want to hang out with them. You don't want them to leave when it's time for them to like go start their own lives. You know, you're always, thinking about where they're at and what you can do for them. You know, which is a good thing. You care about, keeping the family unit together. That kind of, shit. Let's say you're somebody who don't have a family. You still strive to like have that shit one day, despite what you might tell the people. You're trying to be a hard ass or whatever, but really, you just want to have a family one day. You want to have, the kids and all that shit, right? You seek, you know, emotional support from everybody. You know, you need that in order to like feel like you're grounded. You need somebody else to like do that shit for you. Lay it on you. This is what's going on right now. Life is not, great. This situation sucks, but in order to get out of it, you'll have to put in the work. You'll have to do this, do that. But you kind of have to have somebody there to like tell you that. Really good friends who like can see shit for you. But it's like it ain't that you can't, do shit for yourself. It's like when it comes to like building and staying the fuck away from people, cutting people off. You might have a problem with that. Might have a problem, you know, being away from family to do the work, to do your job. But at the same time, once you've like understood things and you're like not so cry about shit. You understand that you're doing that for your family. You're doing it for you know their future. Nothing stops you from going to work or cutting people off. Doing what you have to do. These people don't care. You can go to work. Build the home you want with the people you care for. Um, but your emotions still, play a role in shit. So you might be, crying as you're doing shit. They weren't doing this enough for me. They weren't having enough, um, focus on my needs, my emotional needs, this and that. You know, maybe they weren't, but maybe you have to, understand that it's not always about your emotional needs being met. It's about, what has to be taken care of for, everybody involved. And, ultimately, you're a person who will get the point and, just make it happen. Whatever you have to do, whatever you have to sacrifice. Maybe you have to put in more hours at work, or maybe you have to, you know, not keep people too close to you because people have to like grow and do their own thing sometimes, right? But when you decide to not do that and other things, you have the wisdom to be like, they're still my family. They're still somebody connected to me. They'll we'll come back together and we'll do what we have to do when the time's right. Not all the time. This person is Leo, Saturn in the fifth house, right? This guy or female, they like to lay it on people. I have to, not stay away from having an extravagant life, but to have that kind of life, I have to, put in the work. I have to cut this out of my life. I have to do that. But they want to have a circle around them that can hold them to what they say too. You know, I want to live in a mansion that's, um, oversees the fucking ocean. I want to drive, Lambos and Ferraris and shit like that, right? But in order to do this, I have to, actually, put the work in. I can't, be a partier all the time. I can't do that constantly. I'll still be having fun as I do it, but I can't do it constantly all the time doing that shit, all the time doing that shit. You need a group around you that sees the vision that you have and supports your vision and understands that you take, leadership um in making that shit happen, right? You want that mansion, you want that, house, you want that, you know, whatever, right? You want a certain career, you want to, be, very successful, and you have the confidence, you see it for yourself, you see yourself doing that kind of shit. But you can't get too excited and you can't bend the rules just to have fun. People actually respect you because they know you're that kind of person who likes to, fuck around and have fun. But then, when you're, locked, what you got to do, you're putting all that energy, all that, passion, all that, um, all that energy into just, building your life up, and they see it, they see it coming to fruition, over time, and people, like being around you, you're still positive about shit. You're like, oh, once, this gets done, we'll have the house, we'll have the, I'll have the mansion, I'll be able to, throw parties and, and that keeps you, motivated. But if you have too many people around you who are party goers and shit, they could prevent you from ever getting to that point. So then you have to, put your foot down and be loud with them and be like, no, I'm not doing that shit. I am that guy. I am that girl who does that shit. But right now is not the time for that. It's the time for this. And they'll look at you and be like, damn, you're actually right. I want to, around and do this and that. But right now is not the time for that. We're in a building phase. We're at a phase where we can't be doing shit like that. That happens once we have that, and the quicker we get to that is the quicker we can, get to, having fun and partying and shit. That's why we want that, so we can, do that. You know, you're still, a leader. Um, and then when you have kids, it's like, you know, my kingdom, my rules. I'm the king, and you guys are, to serve me, not to serve you, but basically to serve you and to, do as they're supposed to. They're like the princes and princesses or whatever. You know, your rule matters. It overrides anything they think they can do. Not until they leave and go out, and you encourage that kind of shit too. By the time you're 18, you're out on your own. But while you're here, it's what I say, and you'll discipline your kids as you see fit too. And you probably do have kids. Um, Virgo, Saturn in the fifth house. You, Virgo, Saturn. You definitely make sure you plan everything out. You know, morning routine. You wake up at a certain time, brush your teeth, wash yourself. You leave out the door to go to work. You go to work. Um, when you're at work, you know, you make sure you take your breaks. But then when you take your breaks, you're like right back to work. You're not doing this and doing that. If there's any opportunities to advance at your career, you're gonna seize that opportunity. If you want to stay late and put in extra hours, you'll know when to do that. You'll be like um maybe on my day, because like you're also a person who likes physical activity too. So like after work, you like to go to the gym at a certain time. Maybe not when there's too many people around, or maybe when there's just a certain time you like to go to the gym. You make sure that happens, you know. But maybe you want to stay, at work and get some overtime in, and you like to be that person who's like the example of how you should be, you know, not fucking around, getting the job done, doing everything to a T, dotting your I's, crossing your T's exact, doing everything to the best of your ability, even, offering, support to people, who can like listen to what you have to tell them, and, you even, demonstrate when needed, this is how you properly do something. Um, and doing anything else is just that's not right. That's the shit that'll get you fired or whatever. And you like to be the example of what you should strive to be like. You also take money into consideration. You don't like to take risks. You know um, you do your research on everything. Which stocks are good, which um, what's a great thing to um, get started, what kind of business is good to get started. For me specifically, because you're in a certain career, you're going to make sure you know everything about that, and then you're going to like start your business, and do that. you know there is room for error and shit. You account for that. Maybe one day somebody fucks things up for you. It's fine. You ain't gonna get too sideways about it. Now, if that shit happens too much, but it won't ever get to that point, because you also keep no bullshit around you. When you see it, you like, I can't, fuck with these people. I'll just, do my thing, and I don't care what they say about me or anything, because I know what I'm doing is right, and I always, plan shit out to a T. I'm very methodical about everything I do, meticulous about everything I do. Like I seen everything. They might say you're lost in the details, but it ain't even that. When it's Saturn, you gotta be like that. You gotta eliminate all risks. You know, cutting yourself off from people, who are, not um, smart enough to understand that this is for, my future. I'm trying to create a legacy. It, you know, and that's important to you. And people who like know you understand that about you. It's for my children, and what I'm trying to build is for generations moving forward. I have to not fuck around. I have to like be the one to make that shit happen. So people respect you and they understand that you're about your business. When you have kids, you're putting all kinds of rules on them, critiquing them at every fucking corner. At every, because you want your children to be better than even you were, and that's why you do it. They see you as you're hard on them. You're very hard on them, but ultimately, when they grow up, they'll see that you and what you were doing, would actually save them in the long run. But the next sign is Libra, Saturn in the fifth house. You, Libra, Saturn, are a person who does extra work. So basically, you like to make sure everything's all right with you. Your finances in order. Your, um, uh, relationship with people at work are good. You're on good terms with everybody at work. You're good terms with everybody in the community. But then you kind of like do extra. So whatever I mean by that, you do extra. You make sure that your neighbors and everybody else, you might ask, in conversation, you're like, how's work going? You know, are you doing well at work? Are you, you know, um, are you aware of anybody new who's come through town? Because I have to make sure, that they understand, the community guidelines, the community rules, and like, because you make sure you know all that shit too. If you're a Libra Saturn, you like to really like, because like even if you're not a police officer or any of that shit, you're like always trying to like make sure everything in the community is, cool. You don't want conflict, disturbances, you know, disorder to come to your area. So you're making sure not just that you're taken care of and that your money's situated right, but that everybody else is like that. All your friends and everybody in the community, even if they ain't your friend, people you live beside and shit, you might ask them that shit, because you like, it gives you, security mentally that that, oh man, I live in a place that's great. My neighbors go to work. I know about them. They work at this place and this, and I'm working at my place, and I'm you know this guy at work, and they know me because I always ask questions, and I always make sure everybody's doing what they're supposed to do at work. You know, you try to make sure all areas are covered too. For yourself. You like to bring you like to live in a peaceful kind of community, um, which is a good thing to do. But some people might see it as you're doing too much, but you don't even care because it's not doing enough. If I'm just concerned about myself, if I'm concerned about myself, and Bro, you need some shit by chance? Um, but yeah, man, you people make sure people are on their p's and q's too. At least have a job or have they ain't bringing the community down. You're like the first like person to like make sure things like that are taken care of. You're kind of like doing too much though to some people, but other people appreciate it. Like your friends and people in the community that see you as cool. You're always like making sure because like you're a person who has the ability to, and it's just in you to like want to know what's going on with other people. Sometimes people were struggling and shit, and they didn't know where to go, but you offer them okay, well, if this is going on, I can see if I can help you out. Maybe you want to work here, if you're about to get fired, that kind of thing, you know, and, really, go the extra mile for other people that way. Um, so like they still, fuck with you and stuff. They know that you're about your business, but other people might not like you. But you definitely, like order over disorder in your life, and, setting boundaries when necessary, you know, and having other people set boundaries too. You ain't afraid to let your opinion be known about that kind of shit. But anyways, the next sign is Scorpio. Saturn in the fifth house. Scorpio Saturn, a little bit more emotional sign, right? But you work toward building your life with an intensity that other people may or may not understand. Um, you like the have control over what's going on in your life, your work, you know whoever you're trying to like build a life with. That could be anything, man. That could be you having females, or a female having guys, or having one person they like to have children with, but you want to have control over that at all times. When you feel like things aren't in your control, everything's out of control, and then you become you know a little more toxic, or you know you feel very insecure about you. As long as you have control of the situations in your life, work's going well, things at home with others, significant others are going well, it's good. But when it's not, it's not. And you can be a shitty person to people. um you having control of things can lead to your kids not liking you too. But you take that shit seriously because you deeply care about your children too. It ain't like you don't. you know they may say it's it's absurd or whatever, and even other people might even say it's absurd too, because you care about your kids that deeply. Other adults and shit might say that, but people like me who are like, hey, they're your kids, you raise them how you want to. you know I'm not going to tell you not to. That's not my kid, right? You don't give a fuck about none of that. It's my rules. I control everything. You gotta have control of all the important things in your life. Your job too. You know, you like to have control over that situation. Um, Even if you're like not the boss, right? You have to be on like good terms with your boss, but you also like to let them know that you're a hard worker. You come in, you do what you gotta do, and you don't cause problems for anybody. So any like reason for like you trying to like fire me or anything like that is uncalled for. I'm a guy who, or a person who comes in and does what they're supposed to. You work with an intensity. When you get to work, you get to work. But you're also a person who might not do well at work if you don't have that support at the house, from your significant other, guy or female. And then you start to get emotional, and you start to kind of drift away from reality. But when you have that support, they keep you locked in and on point. with what you gotta do for your family, for yourself, so you don't lose everything you have, your house, your car, and all this other shit, right? But yeah, you definitely probably have kids. But anyways, the next sign is Sagittarius, Saturn in the fifth house. You are interested in a lot of things, but when it comes time for to lock in, you lock in. Um, it might be tough at first though. Sagittarius is a sign that likes to grow and expand, and, experience new things. What you're gonna do is you're gonna go to your job and you're gonna be the one who asks questions. Learn from people. Learn from people who are better than you at your job. You don't care if they're smarter than you or whatever. They have the knowledge you need to learn. You know, to learn if this career is even for you or not. You're gonna like ask questions. You're gonna be like, how do I do my job better? This, that, the third. You're gonna do the thing for a little bit. And then if you figure out that that's not for you, you know, you'll move on. And you're also not gonna like give your time away to any job that you don't want to, right? Because your time is valuable, and you won't waste time too. When it's time to go, it's time to go. And you won't overstay or anything like that. You won't let it get that to that point, and you don't really give a fuck what other people have to say about it because you still learn something from it. The lesson was you weren't meant for that kind of job, and you're probably just doing it to stay afloat or whatever, to have make sure you got some money coming in. But you learn shit from that job, and you might even hop from other jobs and do that for a while. But then when you find that job that you like, you make sure you learn everything about that. you know you try to even make it fun. You try to be a person who um gets other people into that career, and you're like, hey, this career is what you need to get into. These are all the like positive things that you gain from that kind of thing, and you're really like trying to sell people into getting into that career field. You become that guy or that female that does shit like that when you have this placement. And you ain't the most restrictive kind of person, right? Because you believe in letting people live their life and experience things. But then when it comes to a job, you're like, okay, I'm going to make sure I learn everything I can. Even if it is something that's boring, something that is whatever. If there's a positive there, that's the money. You that's the people who work here. Um, they they're people that are worth listening to. You know, maybe not to like hang out and have fun with on the weekends or anything like that, but they're worth listening to. It helps me in the long run when I'm trying to build my business in the future, kind of shit, or when I'm trying to make invest my money right. You still open to hear people about that kind of shit, and you take it seriously too. And people like know that about you. That you've probably had like multiple jobs and other things, but once you found that one that you like, you're like talking to people about it outside of work too, because you like it that much. You see the blessings and benefits that came from that, and then you like try to tell people about it, you know, just casually in conversation, it just comes up. And then when it comes to you having kids, you know, you you don't do when, like, people not listening to you, you know. So you're probably putting belt to ass in your kids. You might even take it too far sometimes. But you also encourage your children to like move out when they're supposed to, kind of shit. Go experience life for yourself. Daddy, mommy raised you this way, and by the time your kids are 18, you're probably like boom, out the door. Not because you hate them, but because you understand that they all live their life. Yeah, you know, do what they gotta do. You already had that time with them to wring their ass when they did things you told them not to. When they talk back at you because you're a person who, well, when you have things and do things, you're kind of like, much like, a kid can't do this kind of thing, and you like, it ain't like you're antagonizing your kids, but it's almost like you are. But it don't matter because, you're the adult and they should respect you, kind of shit, right? Now the next sign is Capricorn, Saturn in the fifth house. Now Capricorn, Saturn is a good placement to have. That means you are gonna, see things for what they are. You're more of a realist when it comes to money, when it comes to necessary moves that you have to make to move your career along. When it comes to relationships outside of that, who you have to like cut off. You were my friend for a time when I was younger, but nowadays I guess I don't need any friends because the workplace people are my friends now. Or you know you don't have any friends, but it's like the things you obtain from removing all those distractions from your life was beneficial, and it wasn't easy at first, but you have it in you to just keep going, keep going, keep going. Discipline, hard work. These are the attributes that you have. Doing it even when you're sick, even when you're tired. You know, the workplace is basically like home to you. At this point, you know, you live at your job. Anytime somebody comes up to you and asks, about something, it's something about work. And like, yeah, I got this to do at work. I got, oh, I have my money here. I'm looking at, I'm watching the stocks. I'm doing this. I'm doing that. It's all related to money and like real things that are going on in the world, as far as you and your job goes, kind of shit, right? Um, may be dry to, your friends and shit, but they respect you because you are a go-getter and you're a guy or a female even that has proof of what you have to say. So then when you do decide if you want to like give information or become a mentor, you're actually a great person to go to, like one of the best people to go to, because you have the like, it's cardinal earth, so you have the necessary steps that people need to take. you know Cardinal earth means initiating practical movement in yourself and other people. That's why you make great managers. you know you move up the ladder quickly if and you probably do if you have this business. Make sure you learn everything. You learn other people's jobs, and then people take note of that. Like, you're doing this guy's job better than him. I need you in that position. I need him to be fired. You're the type of people who do shit like that. um but it's like, for you, it's a great thing. Even when people ain't around and other things, you had faith in yourself to like cut people off, do what you had to do, because you knew that eventually you would have the house, the money, and all that shit. And even a significant other comes through, You lay it on them. I've been doing things this way, and if you don't like it, you have to get out of here, because I'm going to continue to do, job, work, work, work. You know, when it comes to having kids and shit, if you're a guy that then has kids with somebody, you take that shit seriously. That's you. That's your future. You're gonna be hard on them. You gotta work. You gotta make money. You gotta cut people off. It ain't about not having friends, but you would rather learn from somebody who's knowledgeable. They can become your friend. You may even like steer them towards shit like that. You know, you don't want them to have to go through the same shit you went through. It ain't that you want them to have an easy life per se, because you are already, you know, putting belt ass on them when they don't come home when they're supposed to. When they, when you see them, fucking around with groups of friends you told them not to hang out with. You're like that with them. Really setting the fucking tone. Really, putting your foot down when necessary. Next person is Aquarius Saturn in the fifth house. You like to talk to people and get to know what they're about. From there, if you can, trust them to help you build something. You like to build a social network. If things go bad or whatever, you have questions about something. I have a friend that's, does this. I have a friend that does that. You know, one that's really good at, knowing the stock market. I have a friend that's really good at, you know, running their business. And when I start my business, I want to, know everything that I have to do, um, to, get to where he or she is, that kind of thing. So you're not really restricting yourself from people. You're just not listening to the people who, like, you're going to teach those people, right? So basically, you're going to not listen and get mentored from a fool, right? You're going to listen to the people who actually, have the information you want. Be your mentors and shit, right? You're going to be more focused on that if you have Saturn and Aquarius. You know, the time for play is, not there. But you do enjoy learning and, seeing the, benefits from that. Eventually, you have to learn from these people about this, learn from these people about that. You don't care though. You like to, talk and, learn things and even offer, your, um, questions, concerns, or even, new insight into what they might need to, because you see trends and other things too, right? In people, because you're a people person. It's not a people pleaser. You're a people person though, and you like to, know about people, be about people. When shit gets shaky, because life goes through ups and downs. You have friends out here that you can go to for help. That you can offer. You could be the one to offer them help. Because you like to learn different things about life. You have questions about something, so you make sure you learn that. You read books, you do research, you do all that. If you have children, you're the one that lays facts on them. You don't lie to them. You tell them like it is. You also, try to instill in them to think for themselves, do their own research. Even if I tell you something, research it. But I'm telling you, usually you tell them like, I know what I'm talking about because I am a person who does that. You know, and you also do discipline children. You probably do tell them to, stay away from these people and other things. You know, but question shit. Don't ever take shit as That's what it is. You can still, have questions about something. Don't try to let other people convince you to like, limit your mindset kind of shit. And that's what you would probably instill inside of your kids, right? Um, the next sign is Pisces Saturn in the fifth house. This Pisces Saturn, you like to be creative. You like to, also, you could be very emotional, soft at times. Pisces is also known as a sign that likes to escape reality sometimes, you know, the harshness of reality. But when you have a person in your life that's supportive of, the goals you have, as far as, the kind of money you want to make, the kind of career you want to have, you can then be very successful with that person at your side. They deeply understand you. They get you. They can, they're flexible. They understand that you do go through those, you know, emotional ups and downs, but they stick with you through all that, right? And they, this person that you're with, tends to see the positive outweighs the negative, so they stick with you. But when you're alone, it might seem like, the world's out to get you, or, you want to escape through, vices and other shit. But, you are a person who, seeks a deeper connection with people. You have compassion for others. That can go a long way in careers and shit like that. Now, you don't want to get too, connected to people, but you have the ability to like, ask people, how they're doing and shit like that. And like, you're kind of seen as a like person at work that's not necessarily the hardest working, but you offer them, okay, you understand that, we come into work every day and, some of us don't want to fucking be here, but you're also still trying to encourage them, I too, sometimes I don't feel like coming in, but, I like to ask you, how you're doing and other things because, I don't need that affecting me at work. I don't want to be around people who can't, uplift or, you know, do what they got to do when they have to do it. I might have to get a new job because that's going to affect me. You can't go to work with people who, bring the mood down, bring my mood down. Then I can't work effectively, can't make money, right? So you need people around who, get that and, have a little bit of compassion for human life, that kind of shit. Um, and with that, you also are, parent to, when you're a parent with this sign, you like to encourage creativity, but you also, put your foot down when you need to and restrict it as needed. You may even let your kids, have some freedom, but when they, abuse that, well, you ain't their best friend no more. The person putting belt to ass. But anyways, that's all the Saturn size through 12 zodiacs in the fifth house. Next week I'll have the sixth house. We'll begin the sixth house series. With the sixth house or the sun in the sixth house. Now, be cool, call on the corner, and if you want a natal reading from me, that's still $350. That's never gonna change. That comes with your, all your placements, your aspects, your house placements, your planet placements. It also comes with the numerology reading too. So be cool, call on the corner, and wait for my other videos to drop too. And always leave comments in the comments, y'all. I'm not shying away from comments. I'll even reply. I do. So be cool, calm in the corner, and have a good day.